There is considerable risk that Bolsonaro will attempt to overthrow democracy in Brazil. And here's why I think everyone should care about it. I'm recording this video a few days before the celebrations of the 200th anniversary of Brazil's independence, which will happen on September 7th. At first, many, including myself, thought that they would witness the Brazilian version of the US Capitol riots of January 6, 2021. A few weeks ago, Bolsonaro called upon his supporters to take the streets for the last time on Independence Day. And since then, many Bolsonaristas have been planning to leave their homes to protest for the president and against the Supreme Court, the media, and the left. It is still uncertain whether Bolsonaro and his radicalized followers will try to invade public buildings or stir violence in the streets on September 7th. Why should we worry then? Well, because last year they did, and only failed because the leaders of the armed forces and the judiciary branch moved preemptively to prevent chaos from spreading across the country. To a mass of hundreds of thousands of supporters waving flags and shouting slogans like "We must expel China from the Brazilian territory" and "We must invade the Supreme Court," Bolsonaro said, and I quote, "I have three alternatives for my future: being arrested, killed, or victory. The first option is out of the question. No man on earth will threaten me." Moreover, Bolsonaro affirmed he wouldn't follow decisions made by Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who had become the president's nemesis after indicting and arresting some of the president's allies for threatening democracy and spreading fake news. Calling Moraes a scoundrel, he added, "The Brazilian people has run out of patience." If it's true that last year's Independence Day seemed more like a general rehearsal for a coup attempt, what should we expect for the coming weeks before the October 2nd national elections? I'm Guilherme Casarões, a political scientist and university professor, and in this video I'll talk about Bolsonaro's three-step authoritarian scheme. Let me just go through some key assumptions. Unlike what his supporters might say, Bolsonaro represents an objective threat to democracy. There's a growing scholarly literature on how contemporary populist and authoritarian presidents, both left and right, attempt to undermine democratic values and institutions as they get elected. The fact that countries like Brazil, India, or the United States did not immediately evolve into full-fledged dictatorships doesn't mean populists aren't trying to get there. When they sweep into power, they are still constrained by relatively independent courts, electoral commissions, bureaucracy, civil society organizations, as well as media outlets. Winning re-election, however, allows populist governments to undermine checks and balances and build what Viktor Orban has cynically dubbed an illiberal democracy. As a result, citizens are progressively cut off from democratic participation, as we have seen in Hungary, Venezuela, or Turkey. This is why, it seems, Bolsonaro ultimately sees re-election as a matter of political survival. Since he has already spent much of his political capital, both at home and abroad, to remain in power, it is highly unlikely that he will step out of office without leaving a trail of chaos along the way. The conditions for the undermining of Brazilian democracy are already in place. The Bolsonaro administration's first step was to dismantle federal agencies and social policies, to deregulate on behalf of predatory interest groups, and to empower a legion of fundamentalist, incompetent, resented, and corrupt politicians and officials. That includes crooked evangelical pastors, pseudo-intellectual wannabes, second-class business people, and money-hungry military officers of all ranks. Such generalized ineptitude with hints of cruelty has taken a toll on the Amazon and on indigenous peoples, on education and healthcare policies, on the poor and the most vulnerable. More than 680,000 lives have been lost to COVID-19 on the government's watch, while Bolsonaro kept criticizing social distancing policies, ignoring masks and vaccines, and ridiculing the disease and the sick. The second step of Bolsonaro's authoritarian playbook is to incite social divisions by fabricating internal and external enemies. Everyone who's on his side is a good citizen, God-loving individuals who despise diversity and political correctness, who defend the unrestricted freedom to own guns and to insult others, who disguise their privileges as personal merit, and who believe that the only good criminals are dead criminals, unless of course you're a tax evader, a sex offender, or a white-collar thief from their political camp. Everyone who doesn't fit in this category, summarized in Bolsonaro's four ideological pillars, God, nation, family, and liberty, is a traitor of the fatherland, undeserving of participating in politics, or even worse, of being considered Brazilian. Feminists, LGBT communities, and other progressive groups who profess the so-called gender ideology are a threat to God and traditional family values. Human rights and environmental activists and NGOs, indigenous peoples, universities, and the mainstream media are part of an unpatriotic globalist conspiracy who seek to destroy sovereignty and national identities. And finally, whoever defends any form of restrictive policies, from limiting freedom of speech in case of incitement to violence and hate speech, to implementing social distancing and lockdown measures to address the COVID-19 pandemic, are seen as tyrannical enemies of individual liberties. All the aforementioned groups have become evil, devilish communists to the eyes of Bolsonaro and his supporters. But since Brazil's mainstream left is generally moderate and pragmatic, the general sense of threat is built upon cherry-picked, out-of-context statements by artists, journalists, and politicians. To give some concreteness to his fear-mongering tactics, Bolsonaro often associates the Brazilian left with the governments of Argentina, where lockdown policies have allegedly produced poverty and inflation, Nicaragua, where the Catholic Church is being recklessly persecuted, and Venezuela, where Maduro's authoritarian rule has driven society into disarray. The third step is breaking down democracy. As the possibility of an electoral defeat looms, does Bolsonaro have the muscle for an executive takeover or a self-coup along the lines of Peru's Fujimori in 1992 or Venezuela's Maduro in 2017? Bolsonaro's attitudes towards the electoral process have already raised a red flag. Backed by several military and congressional allies, he has spent the last several months escalating his rhetoric over electoral fraud, questioning the integrity of voting machines, and sowing suspicion over the electoral court members. While it is hard to estimate the degree of military loyalty to his authoritarian scheme, what we know is that he enjoys great popularity among middle and low-ranked officials and also among the state-based military police forces. Not to mention the number of citizens with gun license, which has soared from 120,000 in 2018 to more than 607,000 in 2022. If we consider that Bolsonaro is the top presidential choice of 1 in every 3 Brazilians, or some 50 million voters, and that Brazil is more polarized and radicalized than ever before, his anti-democratic rants should raise concerns at home. And if we bear in mind that the global far-right is placing all expectations on Brazilian elections, which Steve Bannon has considered the second most important presidential race of the world, Democrats from all over should also be alert and vigilant.